to say who they are.
I think you do a little introduction and then it'd be good to do.
Oh, God. Okay. Okay. I'm Mick Johnson. I have been practicing architecture for 40 years, mostly in large-scale projects globally. Much of it healthcare, but also corporate. And so this notion of cities and how they change, how they actually get made, has always been a very interesting part, because if you look at the kinds of things that have influence, most often it is related to the number of buildings, the amount of people, where they're coming, where they're going. And if you don't get that right, you get situations that are not very good. So recently, over the last few years, I've been teaching a class at the university that has focused more on the issues that we're going to talk about this morning, or this evening. It has a lot to do with how freeways work, how traffic works, how neighborhoods work and don't work, and what the metrics are, and how that can influence the way we think about design, and about density, and about infrastructure, and all the other things that go with it. So that's been my interest as the interim director of the Metropolitan Design Center. That ends in another couple of months, and Tom Fisher, who's currently the dean of the school, becomes the new director of the Metropolitan Design Center. Bruce?
I'm Bruce Jacobson. I'm a landscape architect. I've been practicing for more than 30 years, about 20 of those now. Time goes by very quickly. 20 of those in the Twin Cities area. I've been a private consultant, a private sector practitioner for all of that, mostly with a focus on the public realm, and more recently working with cities and with neighborhoods and with private development, really taking a look at how all the different layers that we're going to talk about tonight, really the integration of those different things related to public space and infrastructure and movement systems and build form and all those things come together to make really great places. I'm a research fellow at the Metropolitan Design Center, and I'm also teaching at the U. Bob Close and I have been co-teaching a class called Building 21st Century Communities. So there are some very interesting overlaps related to what Mick is doing in his coursework and some of the direction we're taking the curriculum to address some of the issues that we're going to showcase tonight.
Okay.
And thank you for inviting us. It's a great opportunity. I should say too, that one of the co-facilitators of the Grandview District framework when that whole process was going on. So I recognize some people in the room, and we were very much in agreement.
So the Metropolitan Design Center, we've been trying to really focus on the issues that concern our region, the Twin Cities. About the opportunities in built and natural environment. There's always an overlap, and we want to make sure we understand those things that stimulate economic prosperity, encourage social vitality, and enhance human and environmental health. And we'll talk a lot about health. Our focus really narrows down to this. Climate change, which in my mind is about resiliency. Equity. If we don't change the way we deal with everybody fairly, we're going to have major problems in terms of culture and change as it relates to social issues. And then health, and I'm not talking about healthcare. I'm talking about the health of our cities, the health of individuals. How we live each day is about the health of our species. There are major emerging mega regions. And you can see the Great Lakes, and that's Chicago, all the way Cleveland, Detroit. It's a huge region. We see the Northeast, Florida, the Gulf Coast. I'm very familiar with Cascadia. I spent most of my career in Seattle and Portland, Northern California. And you'd notice that on these, the 6 million is the big circle. That's an important understanding about where population is, where it's going, and where we sit up there in the upper Midwest, we're a small circle, about 1 to 3 million. But the influences of these mega regions are going to have an impact on us. And it has a lot to do with, if we start thinking about future climate impacts. So you hear about California all the time right now about lack of water. It's also in the southwest and the deserts of Arizona. It's also happening in Texas. It's happening across the whole southern part of the United States. What does that mean to us up here in the north, where we have an abundance of fresh water? Abundance now, and if we don't take care of it, we'll lose it. That means that our ideas about population could very well change. If we project over the next 15 years that we might have 600,000 to 800,000, if the current trends in the south keep going the way they're going, we could have 5 million more, and we're not ready. We're not even close to being ready for that kind of magnitude of change. So our context really has all of these issues, but again, focusing on the ones that have the most impact, we think, and how that will change the way we think about our cities is important. Health, again, for everyone. We know about population, streets and roads and movement systems. We got to figure out the poverty and equity issue, land ownership, waterways, recreation, city centers, pedestrian, bike, transit, car, in that order, and then transportation corridors in terms of resiliency. So those three, again, highlighted health, poverty, and transportation, we think are important. The way these things work is that there's a series of overlays. We've looked a lot at underutilized land and regional systems. You look outside anywhere in our region, and you'll find land that's not being cared for, land that's sort of thrown away, land that's being used for things that shouldn't be used for. And so we've looked at a lot of those kinds of systems, and we want to use them to reconnect and re-aggregate some of the loose ends that we see. We have to overlay that with the natural resources and natural patterns. Simple thing, but if you look out the window, there's a lot of green out there, and the way that's working is quite beautiful. That's just one small part, and that's the part that's being taken care of. There are many other areas that are not being taken care of. They relate to community, agriculture, and nature. We want to understand those relationships. And then when it comes to regional growth and habitation, we don't see Minneapolis-St. Paul as a center. We see this region as a number of centers. We all have to stand on our own, and we have to relate to one another. So Edina is the center for here. It's not Minneapolis as your center. So that polycentric region, full life communities at every scale is really critical for sustainable culture going forward. So what we've spent some initial time on is then looking at freeway and road impacts on communities. And this is what it looks like. If you go down any one of these freeways or roads, this is what you see. It started in LA in '65. I remember going there as a kid, and your eyes would burn like crazy. I mean, I was going to Disneyland. I wasn't going to this. And then you look to the right, and it hasn't changed. It's gotten worse. The land on either side has gotten worse. It is less taken care of. That's France up there. France is the same size as an LA freeway. We need to talk more about how that really impacts your lives and what that traffic is like. So if you come back to those kind of traffic patterns, we want to look at the density of the region. The lighter colors, the sort of purple color, represent areas of poverty. That's where we drove our freeways through initially in the 50s and 60s. We wiped out neighborhoods, we cut them apart. But that freeway system is also something that connects us and can be a valuable resource if we start to use it as a resource and start to pay for it in the ways in which we should. It connects jobs. Now, we expect jobs to be easily accessed. They're not if you're spending an hour and a half in a car to get to your job. So we have to change the way we think about how jobs are organized. If you look right down here, this is pretty important. That's where you guys are. You have almost as many jobs, if not as many jobs, as Minneapolis. You have half, a quarter, a third of the population. You have more jobs here in Edina than in Minneapolis. That's an important thing when you start looking at the connections that you need to make, the freeways and how they're used. The negative part of the freeway is it has a health issue related to it. And so, again, think about the freeway, and it's really dangerous in the amount of particulate within 300 feet. You have population impacts related to asthma, cardiovascular disease, premature death. For children, unbelievable. Asthma is up. Impaired lung development is not good. Infant health, risk, low birth weight, premature birth. Happens to be where we put all the housing that relates to where the poor go or the disadvantaged. We put elderly in that same location because the land is cheap. But if you look at that risk, it goes for another 1,600 feet. So just think about your street in France, and the amount of traffic's on that, or Washington Avenue in downtown Minneapolis. It's as polluted as a freeway, and yet we allow that to happen every day and don't really take care of it. So here we are. Here's your part of the world. This yellow line is the roadbed, the orange is the pollution. And when you look at that in the greater detail, like in Minneapolis, there's not much left that isn't polluted. And that doesn't include the major roads like Franklin, like Washington Avenue, major roads that cut through our cities. So the impact of our health is being challenged every day. But it also has created this kind of idea that the freeway is a place that is not valuable. It's only about a roadbed. And so if you go out to 494, you go to Highway 100, just think about how those edges have been treated and what that experience is like. So we think that that land, that underutilized land that sits around the roadbed on freeways is valuable. We think it has potential to become green. And what we mean by that is that green, that road system, that underutilized land can have a lot of other purposes. The green, by the way, in that, if we made that a park in Minneapolis, that would be the same size as Central Park in New York, and yet we don't use it for anything at all. So the green potential might be to provide energy. If we go from clockwise, provide energy. We could use the red roadbed that's left, the underutilized land, for commuter high-speed rail. We could bridge it, we could lit it, we could create reconnect our communities and create amenities. We could restore neighborhoods. We could build on it. We could build around its edges. We could create green. We could create district parking. We could use it for economic development. We could be an engine for change. It could organize transit in linked communities. In fact, we could have this kind of scenario if we used it for transit, high-speed rail, where you could go from 3M to Ridgedale, in less than 35 minutes. What would that do to connect people up to jobs? If you're a single mom and you've got a kid and you're trying to get to a good job and it takes you a couple hours, that's not going to have a great sort of impact on your social life, your cultural life, or your children's life. So we've looked at that in a couple ways. We'll get to development in a second that relates to community, but freeway development, there's the roadbed on the left. The existing tax value is zero. It's negative. We pay for it. We don't get anything from it except the use of the road. But if we start thinking about using the underutilized land and started to build on that, then we start getting something that looks like this. So now that value of where that freeway was, we've got district parking in there, we've got increased value, increased taxes, we've got a localized boost in value, property value spreads. We think that can be used to repair infrastructure. So you build and develop, and when that spreads, you get opportunities to start rebuilding what isn't working today. Infill development occurs, you get increase in retail services. That means that adjacent neighborhoods that along the freeway that didn't have access to those services now has them. And that's an important change in the way the community edge works. We can extend green space and we can reconnect neighborhoods. This also happens in the middle of your city. It could happen in between France and York and 494 and 62, and it looks like this. There's lots of open land. If there's not the right sort of ratio of density in that area, then you're going to get lower taxes. If you begin to build density, and density can be a lot of different things, it doesn't mean tall buildings, but then you start to get, again, that increased value. That's an important part of being able to now use that in other ways. That's a way to develop your infrastructure, create more infill, increase retail services or services for the community, extend green space so you're starting to connect it out into the community. So the best part of this, though, is when you think about it this way, you don't touch the existing context. You help it, you support it, but this is about not changing our neighborhoods. It's trying to build additional support for our neighborhoods. This is the most important part of this. When you look across your city and you see these neighborhoods that you all live in, and they're beautiful, they have history to them, they're part of the cultural life that makes this place unique. It's part of the social life. You don't want something to come along because we're saying we've got to change it and change it. What we want to do is to make it better in a way by adding things to its edges and to make good transitions so that that existing neighborhood gets to stay exactly the same way. So let's look at the underutilized land that you have and begin to understand how that can become part of what we want this to be holistically in terms of a better community, a denser community. So regional density land area, so look at 1860. About 1940, we were doing okay. We had great sort of cities, and that was before the car and the freeway took over. They were more compact. The population and growth were at a measure. You could get everything you needed to get everywhere you wanted to go. But then, actually, our density decreases as we get towards 2010, and we get all this land in between our cities. And so we've gone the opposite direction. In fact, the really scary part of that is that if you look at the combined area in our region, population of 3 million, we've got 426 inhabitants per square mile. That's our metropolitan area. That's a staggering number. When you get down to Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're at 6,000 inhabitants per square mile. So there's a big change there. So you start thinking about how we live in between all these spaces. You get to Edina, we've got 16 square miles, and so we're at 3,000 per square mile. So there's some capacity there that we're not recognizing in the way we could then begin to think about the spaces that we have and change those. The other is, if you look at Minneapolis then on the left, in terms of the overall region, we use 608 gallons of gas per person. That means that everyone in here could be spending, every person in the region, all 3 million people, could be in their car every day, every week. That means fathers, daughters, brothers, sisters, babies, all of us, all week long, driving our cars. So and then if you take that and multiply it by 7, that's the number of parking spots that we have on the national average for every car. So you can see we're being consumed by this sort of transportation nexus of the automobile and energy. So Edina, we're at 455 gallons per person. Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you just take the cities themselves, we're at 288. Copenhagen is at 75 gallons per person. That's a city that has a different way of moving people, thinking about the way they live each day. And so the energy costs are really dropping in those cities as you get to the more European model of density. So how do you measure that? This one looks at if you have 3 styles, same FAR, that's floor to area ratio. You have, these are all equal in terms of that, except the way in which you use the land. So you get the first one, number 1 on the left, that's a tower. You got more space in between, but the tower is purposeful. So if we start thinking about, well, what is that space for? It could be for water management, it could be for recreation, it could be for a number of different things. If you go to the second one, it's a little bit more dense and compact, and kind of mid-rise. The spaces in between are a little bit different and used for different things, and the lower one is a much lower scale, much more sort of tight urban space, probably more old city. But all 3 have a purpose, and all 3 can be measured in terms of how you want density to work in your neighborhoods. If you go to the right, it's all about open space and how much open space there is across that metric. And of course, the one on the top is the tall towers with the open space. The thing that I have a problem with some of these is then how does this space get used and used? So scale can have an impact, and then that impact can be a part of how we think about how the space then gets used. Bruce, you want to talk about, we have a...
Everywhere that we go, every project we're working on, every city of various scale, big cities, small cities and so forth, are all looking at these same interrelated issues of, and also relating back to what President Kaler at the U called the grand challenges, what we're putting on the screen here as climate change and health and equity and so forth. These are the issues that every single city is addressing, and a lot of it comes around to failing infrastructure and a number of other items. The patterns of development and the way we've addressed these things over the last several decades is not sustainable. We have to come up with new methods and new approaches as we move forward. So Denver, kind of related to what Mick was setting the stage for here, a lot of what Denver did in the last couple of decades was really based on an enhanced public realm. And when you talk about underutilized properties and taking advantage of some sites that were laying sort of forgotten, at the same time they had a very powerful leadership. Federico Pena at the time came forward and said, imagine a great city. And he talked about building a transportation system that supported it. They talked about the Platte River Valley. They talked about a professional baseball team, world-class conference center. All of those things came together at the same time, but it highlights the fact that as they were examining all of these things and paving the way for world-class development to happen, it was all of this framework of public space and movement systems and infrastructure that really made that possible for all these other things, parts and pieces, to come in and populate these areas. So what you're looking at here is there's a Cherry Creek Greenway on the left, and the Platte River coming through, and where the two join is called Confluence Park, and that's a whole area of redevelopment. I'm sure you've at least heard of or have seen articles about Lodo and the rebirth of much of downtown Denver around their ballpark and so forth. And it wasn't in the sense of urban renewal, it wasn't tear down and so forth. A lot of it was adaptive reuse. A lot of it was really based on working with the strengths of what their downtown had to offer, but to really capitalize on these things in terms of natural resources and public realm and so on. So phased large-scale projects, knowledgeable landowner, enlightened leadership, but what came out of that was better than expected level of investment from the private sector, and it very intensified, but as you look at it, not all tall buildings, but this mix of different housing types, different kinds of height and density models within this whole corridor. Net income of $73.6 million thus far for the redevelopment that's gone on in that part of the city. It's been a positive win-win for everyone. Downtown Austin. Two things about Austin. One part of One of the things about downtown Austin that really came about was a partnership with the university, and so the rebirth of parts of that downtown was really predicated on the university coming forward and making its own investment. But there are other parts and pieces of this similar to Denver where they're looking at underutilized land, the amenity value of riverfront and all of these underutilized parcels, and how do you convert that integrated with a great public realm framework, infrastructure, movement systems, all of those parts and pieces to do these kinds of projects. So the development specs there, we're talking about 45 acres, so I'm trying to think about how these things relate to the Southdale corridor in France and York and so forth. 9.5 acres of public space, it really was the framework for development, but what it led to is all of the development that came in after was mixed-use residential, office users, civic, leisure, and public space, but it was really about jobs creation, public space, housing, and this really fabulous kind of mix related to amenity, related to infrastructure. Also talks about the events. There's a programming component to this. We've talked about this at scale. Where is sort of the center of urban life? Where are people, where are you trying to attract people? Where are they inclined to come and gather at various scales, whether it's large events, small events, kind of how the street functions as part of the public realm. Attracting jobs, it's a big part of what we're talking about here. Mick touched on the fact that with France Avenue in York and so forth, but 76th, 78th, whatever, those corridors are really primed to bring in additional employers. Nearly every residential tower provides significant ground floor space for retail, restaurants, and leisure, augmenting downtown Austin's vibrant street life. So different models, like Mick was talking about in the diagrams, whether you're holding on to more open space and doing more of a tower, or you're kind of spreading it out and lower building heights and so forth. Expanded library, performing arts, and improved transit stations. So cultural pieces are all part of this fabric, the integration of all these different layers to make great cities. Touching on the outcomes, new development exhibit street room concepts that reinforce the public realm by providing a sense of scale, light, and enclosure at the streets, towers for residential and office space, creating compact connected city, variety of restaurants and retail on ground floors encourage street life. Austin Riverfront is emerging as a destination. That's a big part of what we want to talk about. What are the destinations in your city? Neighborhood re-envisioned with support from grants, eco-districts, and that was another thing that we've been talking a lot about. There are a lot of different ways to go at this. The 21st century kind of community building that we were talking about, eco-districts, is becoming a pretty interesting approach. Go back to Mick.
Because in Salt Lake, their downtown hasn't had a lot of synergy to it over time. The City Creek Center is really utilizing a couple blocks of existing buildings, existing infrastructure. It's a 20-acre site, 700,000 square feet of retail, and 1.2 million square feet of housing. So there's a balance between retail, housing, and office space, which is kind of an important thing. If you get one too high over the other, too much retail, or too much office space, then you don't have this balance that creates community. You have too many people leaving or too many people coming in, and not enough people that live and work in that place. So that balance is really critical. The stats on this, I think it's helpful to be adjacent to Temple Square and the LRT line, because that's part of the culture. That's part of new transportation. The program introduces Nordstrom's and Macy's and 90 other stores into the downtown core. It's added 2,000 jobs, so that's really positive for the neighborhood. And so I think it has had a huge impact in the way that people think about it. I mean, here's Temple Square, and so this is what it looked like before they put this project together. So there's a lot of good existing buildings. You can imagine this being in Southdale, a lot of good buildings that need to be kind of connected back together. From a retail point of view, then they looked at it as a linear scheme. They had, you know, a typical kind of retail structure. You've got the big stores at either end that you're going to draw them across this whole plane of activity. And so it looks like this. I mean, I think, wow, it's like, looks like a place you want to be in. It has great scale. The transportation is very accessible. You know immediately how this place kind of connects up, which is part of being in the language of architecture, the language of both public realm space and a sense of what this time is. If you walk through it, there's a lot of different places to be in at multiple levels, so it isn't just one level, one plane. And it's a fabric that's being enhanced that already exists. And so it's that weaving back together of a place and bringing people to every corner of it that makes, I think, this a very successful project. The other one I like very much is, this happens to be in London, King's Cross, and this is a 60-acre development, and 40% of it is public realm, 40%. So that means out of that 60 acres, 40% of it's going to be used in a different way. Part of that is in this notion that the developer had. They said, well, if we pay attention to the public realm, if we take care of every alley, you know, of every square, of every paving, lighting pattern that we have, this is going to be the emphasis, the incitement to build here, that people will want to come. And it's kind of proved out that in the sense that, oops, so you get a sense of the density. So you've got a huge train station that connects up across the channel, but you've got all these potential buildings. They didn't design the buildings. They designed the framework for the buildings. They didn't take that on. They wanted to make sure they understood all the dimensional characteristics. You have places like this, though, that they did build, and that was the incentive to get others to come there. And so who signed up first? Because it was a great public realm, it was a great place to be in, was Google for 1 million square feet. And so it causes people to look at what the structure of a place is. If it's beautiful, if it's exciting, if it's something that connects to the history of the place, they restored 20 buildings. If it's part of the history, the connections, people like it. They sense that they want to be there as well. There's Google under construction. A couple months ago, we were in Seattle looking at how, you know, communities connect using over existing roadbeds and rails. And this is Olympic Sculpture Park. There's actually a major highway that runs through this, also a rail line that runs through it. So part of the idea was, how do you get the community that's sort of more towards the west over this these roads and down to Elliott Bay. And they devised this method of, when you're on this landscape, you don't even know that you're over anything below you. You have this sense of easy walk. It's all accessible, so anybody gets to go, everybody gets to go. There's an amphitheater, there's places to be in, things to do. And it's really reinforced development on the edges that's brought about, you know, increased property values and a change to the way people thought about, which was kind of a hole in the fabric. They've also been able to restore the salmon fisheries that are along the edge of it, all the way down to Elliott Bay. So that has made a huge impact. And they did this in a way that's really unique in the way they organized the structure. Everybody thought it was going to cost millions and millions. It came in well below their projections because of the way they thought about it, the way they organized it, and the way they conceived putting it together. So you see it's a pretty active place and quite simple in many, many ways. Create a destination that champions art, landscape, and urban life. That's a pretty good key design strategy, I think. Development of public space, again, this is over Freeway. And this is, again, the underutilized land concept. You find the right place between two things, between an arts district and an area that's developing, that still has a lot of holes in it, and you build a 3-block park over Freeway in Dallas. It looks like this, looked like that before. They put the park over it. Pretty simple structure. It has a couple pavilions in it, children's play area, performance space, and there you see that's the Dallas Art Museum, and then the National Sculpture Center. The thing that they thought about this was that they were going to do this park, and they hoped they would get $350 million in new development. In the first year, it was over $1 billion in new development, because these are the kinds of places people want to be in. And so I was there a couple months ago, less than that, a month ago, and this place was just the first sunny day. The grass was already beginning to wear out. There were so many people in this place. And so you can't deny that public space, done in the right way, is what brings people together. It really does create that sense of place, and a sense that development is a part of how we make places better, not how we make places worse. And then last, I want to share a little bit about Portland. I started working in Portland in the early 70s. I was a student first, and then looking at urban areas. We were actually a group of students that were battling a high-rise that was going up in downtown Portland that was going to wipe out, several houses that were Victorian-style houses. It didn't go anywhere, except it got people sort of interested in what kinds of places we were living in. It was also at the same time where they were planning a new freeway that was going to connect out east of Portland called the Mount Hood Freeway. All of those things were beginning to cause people to have this sense that the city was outside of their control. There were all these infrastructure projects, all these big buildings that were going on, and nobody who lived there got to participate. And along came the first mayor that I ever really paid attention to, was Neil Goldschmidt. He came in and reorganized the Planning Commission, reorganized how the process for design was going to work. They defined the whole city, every building, every corridor. They made rules up like 75% transparency on all sides of your building. Simple things that everybody had to plant a tree. If you were a developer, you had responsibility to the public realm, and so you had to take care of it. It wasn't the city's responsibility, so you had to put trees in. You had to do things that contributed positively to that city. So you got development that then started to happen that looked like what happened in the Pearl District, in an existing warehouse district that was also connected to a bunch of rail yards that were being abandoned. The great thing about Portland, it has 200-foot square blocks, which means there's a kind of density to it built in terms of pedestrians. What people used to tell me is, thank God they're 200 feet long on a side. That means that no one architect can do too much damage. So, it was a great thing for my ego at that time. But it really did make a difference. That kind of scale means that every 200 feet, things are changing. There's variety. And so being able to understand how that can then impact the way in which you walk through a city. Because you walk across Portland and you have this sense that you've not taken any steps at all, but you've seen everything. And it's that scale that brings you into this place. Go ahead. That's a park? You mean this?
Yeah, is it a reed pond, or?
No, this is just water infiltration as part of the park system. There's a park system called the Park Blocks that starts up at the university and works its all the way through down to the river. And there's these series of parks that happen along. This is one of them. They actually believe it's okay to use wood as walkways and change the variety of textures. There's a lot of brick in Portland. There's a lot of stone. Transit way, rail is defined different than bus. So you might have more cobblestones on the transit, rail transit than on the bus malls. Everything gets changed up, but there's a palette of richness there that is controlled by quality. And that's really the key. If you look at everything that they do, there's a standard that doesn't get sort of changed out because of a new idea. That new idea has to meet that quality meter. So you look at the scale of these buildings, and it's quite varied. You really don't see many tall buildings in Portland. You see a lot that are in that 15-story, a lot that are in that 6-story, 8-story. I mean, quite a variety. You do get the taller ones in certain areas, but it's that scale that makes it really interesting city to be in. And then its connection to green is always apparent. There's lots of trees, there's lots of canopy. So if you imagine what these kinds of trolleys and things like that do, the rail things, they connect, but they bring investment. They offer a way of connecting. Imagine in your city of being at 494 and go all the way down France to 44th, what that would do in terms of connecting up Edina. Maybe you make a left and end up here. Or think about how that whole network begins to change the way people work, live in a place. So that's all the stuff we're going to show, except that I think it's a couple things that are important to me, that we keep a focus on health. I mean, health is, again, not health care, but health in terms of how we live each day. We're able to walk to work, we're able to walk to entertainment, we're able to walk to get groceries. It's all accessible. And we let go of the car. We keep our focus on equity and jobs. I mean, a big part of great environments or great cities is jobs are everywhere. Jobs are down the street and around the corner. They're not 5 miles, 10 miles away. They're everywhere in the place you live. We want to make our community connected, recognizing that neighborhoods are all unique, that the way in which that housing stock was built and the time it was built, the way you live in it is unique, and you want to connect it to new things. You don't want to push it away. You don't want to push it aside. You want to create a positive framework for development. A framework for development means that as a community, you've defined what development means. You've defined the scale of development. You've defined the public realm in a way that development supports the life of your city. You increase density in the right places. There's a lot of wrong places to have density. And the right places are really critical because they'll become a catalyst for growth. That we want to make our infrastructure resilient. We've gone the wrong way too long. And so how we develop density and development can be a catalyst, again, for how we might rebuild, other infrastructure. And then we've got to make our community sustaining. If we don't find ways to make Edina unique, keep it the way it is, and grow it, so we can sustain the culture of this place, then we're missing a great opportunity to share that with our kids, to share that with those who come after. So, thank you.
Thank you both. Questions? Yeah, Joanne.
Can you, just real briefly, because I know on our schedule, but just kind of use one of your examples, one of your case studies, and tell everyone kind of how it worked. Who were the partners? How did how was that land consolidated under one development, or the funding? I know, just kind of briefly talk about the partners and the process.
Yeah, so there's a couple different kind of partnerships. I mean, obviously, the more land somebody controls, the more that they can, do the right things, hopefully. They can also do the wrong things. So what I liked about Portland historically was that they created such a tight envelope for the framework for development that developers then all had to fit into that. And didn't scare
Could you
anyone.
elaborate on that a little bit, because what I wrote down, excuse me, Joanne, what I wrote down was the Portland planning process for change. They had an emphasis on quality, but they also were very specific. And they were very specific, starting with public realm. But you also are saying they were very specific with regard to development.
Right.
As well. Could you elaborate on
So
that?
specific to development meant there were building heights that needed to be met into certain corridors. So that if you shape a city and your view, is out towards this golf course out here, but you put something in front of it, that's not shaping your city to take advantage of the view. And so they wanted to make sure that all their beautiful views of Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams and Mount Hood, that kind of keys you into how you want to organize those view corridors. And then they also wanted to make sure that the scale of streets, so they have streets, some are 80 feet wide, some are 60 feet wide, that you had a relationship between the height of the building cornice at the edge of the street and the width of the street. Because that said that daylight was important, so I want to shape that. And then my sidewalks, depending on where I'm at and what kind of street I'm on, were either 12 feet or 20 feet or 15 feet. So there was differences based on the corridors and pathways through your city. I think those are really critical things to do, because that offers then developers a way of addressing their development. They just have to solve those problems and make sure that they bring that forward in a conscious and considered way. Still is a lot of flexibility. If you look at Portland, it seems like there's no end of innovation in that city in terms of buildings, but there's quality at the public realm. And then they made sure that every element in the public realm, bus shelters, seats, planters, all had this consistent quality. They were all designed differently depending on where you're at, but they had the same quality.
It might just to build on that real quickly, I think that the plan for Portland, the early stages of what they wanted it to become, was featured in the AIA National series when they were looking at different cities in revitalization in the late 90s, called, it was either, I think it was in the Becoming Good Neighbors PBS feature. So that one might be interesting to look at. They, just what did they want it to be, and now what does it become?
Right. And I think those are the kind of community activism that happened in the 70s when Goldschmidt started this whole process going forward. And then things came, like the bus mall, transportation. That was the first thing in the late 70s, and then rail in the 80s, and other things that kept going to support those kinds of ideas.
And one of the issues that I remember that being addressed in that particular program was also the issue of affordable housing and diversity within, so that a variety of people could afford to live and work in that area. And I know that's come up in the Southdale area. So.
All of your examples seem to feature major downtown areas, and it reminds me of what is taking place downtown right now in the North Loop area. So how do you view those as different from a suburban community like Edina? Because we're not a downtown area here, we're a suburban community, and I don't see what happened in Portland and Denver and Dallas was taking place downtown Minneapolis being as applicable to a suburban setting.
What I would challenge on that is that when I was in Portland in the late 60s and early 70s, there were so many parking lots, I thought it looked a lot like Southdale does right now. Empty spaces. Lots of cars being parked down there, but no sense of where that what that was going to become and how it worked. And retail was spotting it, and there were some good things and some bad things. I think, to me, Edina has 50,000 people population. That's a city. To me, it's not a suburban community, it's a city. And it has the same interests that all cities have. I want to have good transportation, I want great shopping, I want, great schools, I want places to recreate, I want to be all over this town, I want to get where I want to get to. Well, the way that Edina is right now, I think, if I were to compare that to other places, you have the same major traffic problems that are going to stop you from getting to all those things. And so we have to come back to city metrics about how people move and what's the easiest way to move, and be able to walk to more things and be able to get to
I think in response to Mark's question, seeing what you presented, you also talked about we have to sustain our culture. And so Edina has to know what its culture is, and what it wants to be. And it could be that, in fact, we have all of these amenities that you showed, particularly if it concentrate on the public realm, but the scale is different because we choose to make it different because our culture in Edina might express itself differently.
Yeah.
I wanted,
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's a big part of this, is to figure out what that is so that you can design appropriately to that.
Yeah, because I would agree, I don't want to see the Southdale area necessarily transformed into downtown Minneapolis. I don't think anybody does, and in fact, Michael at the first meeting talked with us a little bit about the difference between suburban and urban being characterized as downtown Minneapolis. And that Southdale in the future might be somewhere in between. It might be something totally that we don't think of today. But again, my sense is if we know what the values of Edina are, if we know what the culture, what we want to be going forward in the future, and it seems to me that methodology that's been used in other places of two things. One is concentrating on the public realm, and then being very specific. But you also talked, and your London example I thought was quite interesting, even though it's London, and I know that's a mega place, but where you said they didn't design the buildings, but they framed all the buildings. And I think what's lacking here is we see projects going up. I know it's very frustrating to residents in Edina, is that they see projects going up today, and it's the wrong orientation. It may be the wrong scale in a particular location. It violates a view corridor. So I mean, what's going on currently in Edina seems to me to be almost the antithesis of what you talked about. But it doesn't seem to me that what you talked about is invalid if in fact we understand our own selves, understand our culture, and then scale appropriately.
See, I think when in Edina, you might want to start at 40% public realm, 40% open space, because that's what I see out here. And then test it. Test it. Is that going to work? Is that going to get us to the services that we want? Or can we put a little more density here, and will that help us? I think those are the, you don't want to, you really don't want to be like Minneapolis, because Minneapolis hasn't taken care of its public realm. It hasn't defined it, and today, it still hasn't defined it, and they've been working at it for 30 years.
You also talked about sustainability, and again, we have a great example. Jim Nelson talked about during the recent recession that Centennial Lakes, which has 1 million square feet of office space, didn't miss a beat. The tenant moved out, a new tenant moved in, the rates didn't decline in terms of cost per square foot rent. And yet, because of the public realm that's around there that we think of as Centennial Lakes, we almost don't recognize that there's that kind of density there.
Well, places like that are the genesis of a lot of these cities. You talk about the creeks, the rivers, the open space. They're all part of that same kind of metric that people hang out and they go, wow, I love being here. I want to be here. I don't want to be over there. I want to be in this place.
I also think it's the process that you've entered into, and the examples that we're showing, most of it's grounded in a very similar, a start, just like this room. And so whether it was the scale of Austin or any of the other examples, what I think is really crucial, and Michael and Colleen and others are starting to lay out this roadmap, is that in very simple terms, and Harvey, you were talking about it a bit, is that you're in the process of defining what you care about. And that's the principles behind this. What is this place? And then the next piece is defining what makes Edina unique. What is the context for this conversation? You're not going to throw it all away. You're going to protect some of these things. You're going to protect the character that's here, and you're going to build on that. And every example we showed was well past the 60s urban renewal, kind of squeegee it all and start over again kind of thing. It was oftentimes grassroots, neighborhood-led. Don't do this to us. Let's stand up and take control of the process and take control of the outcome. And the third piece is define what you want people to do. Define what your expectations are for performance after you lay out this roadmap, and those are the rules. And every single example we had on the wall, they established the rules in some form or fashion. Most of the time, grounded in a public realm framework that was really powerful. Drove up value, catalyst for bringing in jobs, catalyst for new housing of every type, placemaking. This is where people want to be. So it's such a cool process that you're starting off, and it's right there in your hands.
Mick, you mentioned the balance of retail, housing, office space as an example, as a balance. Why is that important?
Well, what we've been finding is if you go back to basic small towns, like 5,000 people, town I grew up in, you know, you had all those things, you know, the balance was all there because as a kid I could walk to every one of those. And I felt safe to do so. And so you start trying to understand what's the right size for this to really happen. If I get too much office space, I get downtown Minneapolis, which is better than a doornail at night, right? And it's not safe. But if I get a balance of people that live and work in a place and recreate in that same place, then the public realm is always full of people I know. You know, people I know. And so that's what I think really starts to make sense to me in terms of balance.
It's not about zoning, it's not about no car, but it's saying, we use the term full life neighborhoods. And we would like you to consider sort of the richness of what that means and how you might recast that as part of this. What does that mean? It means that every part of your city has this opportunity to be much more walkable and have the services close by, and the job and the school and the park and all those parts and pieces are right there. The whole city still functions as, you know, as the population of 50,000 going up, but all the parts and pieces also function really well as pieces of the whole.
It strikes me that Minneapolis made years ago some really great decisions about land use, primarily the chain of lakes and what was developed around it, and it set a pattern for residential development surely around all of the significant lakes in the city. I'm curious whether you think we are preserving that public realm, that part of the public realm of the city of Minneapolis as we should. Are we doing as good a job as stewards of that great asset that the people 50, 60, 80 years ago did?
I don't think so. I mean, because we're not extending it.
Yeah.
I mean, we got it, but when we went, oh,
I'm gonna argue with you in a minute.
Yeah. I think the riverfront is one kind of place, but if I think about where everybody else is, it's those little trails and things that you move through as a kid or as a place that you want to go walk after dinner. It's that kind of experience, getting back to nature. And I think we want to find a balance between what we need to like change the way we use water, the way we see landscapes develop, the way nature corridors run through our neighborhoods. I was out last night. You know, I got fruit trees. You know, the worst kind for deer is pear, right? And so I'm out and chasing deer last night out of my trees. And it's because, you know, I live in a place that there are deer there, you know, and there are all kinds of birds and animals all the time. I want to be in a place, I want to live in a place that I can walk to the grocery and still have that experience. And I think we all do. I think that's living on this planet, is living with that kind of interest and participation and respect for all those other critters out there.
How did Portland's quote redevelopment plan look different than a typical master plan zoning map for a city?
Well, I think it was, in my mind, it always was a lot more prescriptive. It was form-based and not sort of something that, you know, if you do X, Y, and Z,
Not
you get these.
prescriptive, but more performance.
More performance, not more performance.
So not saying thou shalt do this, but giving you some
Right.
flexibility in the design, but it was about the outcome is what you were talking about. This is how we want the finished
I
product.
think they missed it in some areas over time, obviously, but I think you could define the way a street works by form. It's, if you never get the corners higher than 60 feet and the street is 60 feet, and then you step back and go up higher, you're always going to get light in the street. Right? That's a kind of big deal. It's a big deal here, especially on the south side of the street when it's 20 below and there's snow piling up. And if you could get some sun and you put a wider sidewalk on the north side, you would start to get that, get warmer and be more pedestrian, and snow would melt a little quicker. But, you know, and so you sort of give up on the north side or the south side of the street because that's always going to be in shadow. That's that north side. That wider street or that wider sidewalk is a godsend in the winter, and it makes pedestrian corridors.
How much did, I mean, I understand the idea that there was more definitive rules in a way, how developers would work, but you had to incentivize them in some way in Portland to make them want to do things. And one of them was to define a zone outside of which no growth could happen with the urban growth boundaries. They defined that early on, and it really made people look back toward the center and make certain that they used every bit of available land to its fullest potential. We don't do that very well here, or at all.
But, you know, the other thing that happened, though, is that people began to see that if we do this, all the value goes up. Everything gets better. It doesn't get worse. And so there's a point, where it turns and people go, well, this is the way we should do it. And that's when everybody goes, ah, you know, now they're developing all those open spaces and there's not many of them left. The problem they have now is they've got a great dense city, very walkable, but they still have too many cars. They still have too many cars. It's a plague. Yeah, well, they've got the whole West Coast. They come to Portland. It's top word. Yeah, it is. Yeah, good social town.
You guys have an agenda.
Yeah, is there any other questions for Bruce or Mick before we jump back in? Bruce, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.